Hi, good day. This is Joe Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in philosophical anthropology. And we are now in the third part of the lecture on man as a religious being. So, we discussed today Buber on his notion of the eternal Tao and faith. So, let's start with a very brief introduction on Martin Buber. He is a Jewish philosopher. Uh, One of the existentialist philosophers who we call to be a theistic or atheist existentialist philosopher during the contemporary era. And he's known for his philosophy of dialogue, the notion of the I and thou, and his philosophy of education, among other things. So today we are going to discuss his thoughts on religion and faith. So Martin Buber, as I have already mentioned, um, he is Jewish by descent. He absorbed the intense and mystical faith and piety of the Jewish tradition, particularly Hasidism. Okay? And his first encounter of Hasidism was during his childhood days. It was his grandfather, Solomon Buber, a Hebrew scholar, who taught him the religious wisdom of this doctrine, Hasidism. And as a child, Buber recalled that, and I quote, I had received an image of the Zadik, and through the solid reality had glimpsed the pure idea, the idea of genuine leader of a genuine community. Now, a Zadik is a teacher in the Hasidist tradition. Uh, Hasidism is uh, I call one of the forms of Judaism that was established in Eastern Europe uh, during the time of Buber. And it's one of those movements in Judaism that emphasize the joy of life, the joy of living. Right. So um, for Martin Buber, it was the chief formative influence in his life. And according to him, it appealed to him because of its emphasis on joy, on love, on meeting, on relationship with God and fellow man, the present hour, prayer, and the true self. And the Hasidist redemption lays in devout, you know, devout deeds, uh, fervent prayer, single-hearted devotion to God, and so on and so forth. So it was not a very, really not a very rigid form of Judaism. No? So it was not the traditional type of Judaism, the rabbinic type of Judaism. Right? So, according to him, God's glory can be found in all things, and man must live a life of holiness, of joy and purity in this world. And Buber stressed that Hasidism does not mean a turning away from one's fellow man and from the world in order to be totally devoted to God. In other words, uh, there are those who would say that if you want to be devoted to God, then you have to focus your attention to God and just abandon the world or abandon your relationship with fellow man. So, well, there is some form of mysticism in Hasidism, but it's not a kind of private mysticism, but a communal mysticism of love. If you watch the Hasidists, they always commune, they always gather together in praise, no, in prayer. So it is after the establishment of a true community, and I think that's the emphasis there, a true community founded and based on brotherly love and interpersonal relationship among its members. So we can see that much of the thoughts of Buber about his philosophy of dialogue, his notion of community, devotion to God, right, were actually formed during his childhood when he was into this, uh, when he was taught or brought up in the Hasidist tradition. But Buber was also influenced by other thinkers like Kierkegaard, from whom Buber saw the importance of a direct relationship between God and the individual. Okay, we have just discussed the notion of religiosity, spirituality of Kierkegaard. So this individual who must constantly raise all in the concrete uniqueness of its new situation, remember the repetition, and in this process emerge as a genuine person before going out to relate with others. So for Kierkegaard, you have to establish that direct relationship with God in fear and trembling, as we have said. So he stood firmly with Kierkegaard's insistence that being a single one, we have to refuse to be swallowed up in the crowd. You know, there's a distinction between the crowd, the mass of people, and the single one. Okay, so yes, there is a congregation, but there must be a personal relationship with God. So you have to uh, be a single one out of our own subjectivism, you know, and we have to trust God. Remember the leap of faith of Abraham. So the single one is the person who is finding himself. And Buber agreed with Kierkegaard that man realizes the image of God through having become a single one, meaning a unique individual, okay? A unique individual who is directly related to God. So he said, to become a single one is to fulfill the first condition of all religiosity. The single one corresponds to God or relates to God. Man can have dealings with God only as a single one. So with Kierkegaard's single one, Buber came up with his own understanding of the single one. The goal of the single one is to enter into relation because the real person is able to have a complete relation of his life to that of the others, you know, when he becomes a single one. But for Buber, to be a single one is not meant Socratically. I mean, uh, knowing yourself, examining yourself. But the intention of the single one for Buber to have the right life is to enter into a relationship. And that relationship, according to Buber, is not limited to God. We relate also to our fellow human beings, okay, to our fellow men. So for Buber, as I've said in the previous discussion, relationship is triadic. It's a relationship between the self, God, and the others, meaning the fellow man. Okay, so let's go now to one of the main points of this lecture, our relationship with God, whom Buber called the eternal now. So, for Buber, the relationship with other human beings is only possible in terms of our relationship with God. And of course, he referred to Jesus in the Bible. He considers Jesus to be his brother, rightly so, because they are both Jewish. So, according to him, Jesus, when asked about the greatest, you know, the greatest commandment, he answered that we should love God with all our hearts, with all our mind, with all our souls, and we should also love our neighbors as we love ourselves. So it's very important that we establish our relationship with God and with fellow men. Right? So life of dialogue encompasses our relationship with our fellow human beings, the finite nows, and God, whom Buber called the eternal Tao. Now, of course, why the eternal Tao? Well, because God is an eternal being. Our fellow men are finite. And not only that, our fellow human being may stop to be a thou to us or for us, right? They may treat us as a need, but God will never treat us as an object. God will always treat us as a human being, as a person. So He will always be eternally a thou to us, although sometimes we treat Him as an it. But for God, He remains to be eternally a thou for us. So man is essentially oriented to God, the eternal thou. And according to Buber, human life is a summon and sending. A summon and sending. So it's a term used to refer to that relationship of give and take, a two way process. Okay, so every man has his unique being as a gift from God, and it is his responsibility to realize this life, this gift in its wholeness. Okay, so for Buber, man's relation with God is one, of course, of dialogue, relationship, through dialogue. And the religious man commits his whole being, his entire life, his entire self in God or to God in dialogue. Okay? Dialogue with God, dialogue with the world, dialogue with his fellow men. And he stands firm in this dialogue. And Buber writes, and I quote, God made no tool for himself. He needs none. He created for himself a partner in the dialogue of time. Because, of course, God, as the absolute person, does not need anything, does not have to create anything because he is complete in himself. But he created man because, for Buber, God wanted to have a partner in the dialogue of time. And in this dialogue, again, I'm quoting Buber, God speaks to every man through the life which he gives him again and again. Therefore, man can only answer God with his whole life, the way in which he lives this given life. So, for Buber, our life is our response to God's invitation for a dialogue. Okay? So, the basis for all this, okay, our faith, is the dialogical relation of trust. You have to trust God, not simply in the belief of the dogmatic commandments, okay? Because there are those, according to Buber, who may say they believe in God but live in His back. Meaning, well, you understand the commandments, you probably teach the commandments, but you don't live according to those commandments. You don't live your life according to those commandments. Okay, so for him, if you truly trust God, okay, if you truly trust Him, then you have to live your life according to His precepts, according to His commands. So he said, he who trusts Him lives in His face. All right? Trust is proving trust in the fullness of life, in spite of the experience, of course, of the world. Okay? So for Buber, religious faith does not result from the mindless recitations of all these religious formulas or from the adherence to unintelligible liturgical routines or from the total commitment to one's being in one's life to the eternal God. In this sense, he's, you know, he agrees or he's one with Kierkegaard that when you say faith, it does not mean this mindless recitation, of all these prayers. If you recite those prayers, you have to recite those prayers with total devotion, with total commitment of your life. Okay, uh, and if you join the liturgy, it's not just a mechanical uh, participation. You are there, but your mind is somewhere. But it should be a real commitment of yourself to God. So there is no statement about God which is not at the same time state something about man. When you say something about God, you also say something about yourself. For Buber, the biblical history of the belief of Israel is a living tradition, a dialogical history between God and man. From the calling of Abraham out of his, place in Canaan to the covenant at Mount Sinai with Moses, of course, up to the prophets, a dialogical history which demands everyone who joins it. So it's for Buber, the early history of Israel is a total uh, dialogue between God and his chosen people. So God, the absolute person, becomes a person to meet man in supreme meeting. The supreme meeting. Because there's, of course, the meeting between man, but there is a supreme meeting between man and God. Okay, so you meet the eternal Tao in that supreme meeting. Okay, so in that meeting, man turns to God. And this turning is nothing less than our redemption in God, the eternal Tao, the absolute person. Okay, so when we turn to God, it's the source of our redemption. Okay, so by turning towards God, we enter into a life of relationship. And we receive the presence of God as a power, as a gift, as revelation. So revelation is the presence of God in our life. Okay? So our life becomes laden with meaning, meaning which, well, maybe sometimes heavy to bear, okay, but nonetheless real, it's palpable and reassuring because of our direct relationship with God. And neither synagogue nor a church nor mosque nor university can determine what this meaning is for us. Okay, so the idea of Kierkegaard here uh, is very very visible, in this idea, in this thought of Buber. And therefore the meaning of my life, for example, in the context of my meeting with God, is specific to the circumstances of my life. Okay? So it gives us the strength and courage to confront the problems of our lives, of our communities, of our world, because of our commitment to God. So when we enter into a relationship with God, we perceive we are responsible for those we consider to be strangers, even enemies. So when we have established that relationship with God, that motivates us to establish good relationship with others, not just our friends, but even those people we don't know. Okay? So the man and woman or woman who has established this relationship with God has abolished moral judgment forever. What is this moral judgment that he is talking about? The moral judgment about people. All right, the people are these, people are like that. No, we just consider them to be our fellow human beings, regardless of their affiliation, regardless of whether they are one with us. So now, let's talk about these three concepts. That is, we also find these concepts in Christianity: the concept of creation, of revelation, and redemption. And for Buber, as a Jew, he considers this notion of creation, revelation, and redemption as the stages in the relationship between man and God. All right? These are not manifestations of God, but rather these are stages or actions or events in the course of our relationship with God. Okay? So these are the stages between, between God and man. Creation, according to Buber, is that by which man is given a ground on which to stand. And from that, man is able to get out and meet God, his fellow man, and the world. So creation is like uh, God created. Remember, I already said that he did not have to create, but he created because he wanted to establish or wanted to have a partner in relation. So creation is like man is given a ground to stand on, and from that situation, from that from that condition, from being created, we're able to meet God, and we're able to establish relationship with fellow men in the world. So it is creation which grounds Buber's belief in man's spontaneity and freedom. Okay, that cannot be modified by any original sin. Okay, and in man's responsibility that cannot be abridged by any faith. So yes, we may have uh, uh, the first man and woman may have sinned, but man remains to be in relationship with God. It was broken because of the sin, but the ground remains. We are still there. Okay, God did not abandon us. Okay? So through creation, God, the absolute person, who is not a person in the ordinary sense, he becomes one, so to speak. He becomes a person, so to speak. To know and to be known, to love and to be loved by us. So because of creation, we come to know God. So creation happens to us, burns into itself in us, recast us in turning and burning. We tremble in faith, we submit, we take part in creation because we meet our Creator. We reach out to Him. Okay, so it's the creation is not really an just one particular event. No, that out of nothing God created something. No, so there is a much richer, more profound meaning of creation. So the paradox of creation is that God sets the world and man at a distance and yet remains in relationship with Him. So God is the absolute, we are finite, so there is always a distance, okay? A distance between us and God. Okay? But it is a ground on which we can stand on and give meaning to our life. So it's a ground where we can meet the Creator. Okay? It's a ground, the grounding of man. And it's a ground from where we can address God. Now, what about revelation? Well, revelation for Buber as a Jew was neither about fixed objective truth or a free subjective inspiration. He has a different view of revelation. Revelation is about hearing and responding to the voice. That voice is, of course, God's voice that speaks to man out of creation and history. So God created man, gave him a ground, and then from that ground we can hear the voice of God. We can hear the voice of God. So revelation is a kind of invitation from God to man to enter into a relationship with God. Okay, so it is an event, a happening that at times light and at times heavy. But this revelation is not past. It it didn't just happen once and for all. Revelation is constantly happening. It is an eternal source of our strength. The eternal contact persists. The voice sounds forth, meaning there's always that you can always hear the voice of God, God's invitation. So because of that invitation, of that perpetual, eternal invitation, therefore the eternal relationship with God persists. That's why God is an eternal now. because constantly, eternally, we hear his voice. We hear his invitation. Okay? So that's the meaning of revelation. The hearing God's voice who constantly speaks to us, inviting us to a relationship with him. Now, what about redemption? For Buber, redemption cannot be relegated to God's side or to man's alone. For example, that uh, God sent His Son to redeem us. Okay, uh, redemption for Buber is the bringing of ever new layers of world of it into immediacy of the Tao. What is the meaning of that? Uh, we hear the voice, all right, and if we respond to God's invitation, if we establish that Tao relationship with Him, then we are redeemed. So redemption is not a one event for Buber. It's it embodies the partnership, the relationship between God and man. So the partnership of man and God in creation, the rising of human cosmos built out of a genuine community, redemptive life of relationship. It's the shining and the steaming of constancy that if we can always transform the I it relationship into an I thou relationship, then these are all hints of redemption. So every time we establish a relationship, a genuine relationship with our fellow men, every time that we treat our the environment, nature, okay, properly, every time we take care of our environment, every time we reconnect with God, these are all hints of redemption. Okay, so we are redeemed when we establish genuine relationship with God, with fellow men, and with the world. So the completion of redemption, of creation, and the response to revelation are the beginning of redemption. The true meaning, the true beginning, time and again, come from man's turning towards God in joy, in thanksgiving, even in despair, even in crisis, even in security. So even during this global pandemic, when we return or turn back to God, then there is redemption. So redemption is a transformation of the whole life from ground up, the transformation of the life of all individuals and all communities. So every turning is a ground for a fuller and deeper redemption into a renewed reality of relationship. So for Buber, creation, revelation, and redemption show themselves as the three aspects of a single event, stages of a single event, the meeting of the finite Tao and the eternal Tao. The finite Tao, man, and eternal Tao, God. Okay? So let's go now to the next point, faith and belief in God. So how does Buber define faith? For Buber, faith is a relationship to the one, that one is God, without being able to give sufficient reason for this belief. Even if you cannot give reason to the existence of this one being, we still establish that relationship. But this inability to give sufficient reason is not a matter of defect on our part. Okay? The nature of this relationship with this being, with God, does not rest on reason, nor does it spring from reason. Because reason cannot give or cannot account for such faith. In faith, my entire being is engaged and the totality of my nature, you know, is fully there. We totally commit to that being of our belief, of our faith. Again, this is somehow similar to the idea of Kierkegaard. So we enter into that relationship as a whole being. And rationality is just part of my being. Okay? So the relationship of faith is a relationship of my entire being. So my relationship with God is a relationship of my entire being, of my entire self, of my entire life. Okay? Now, at this point, Buber distinguished two kinds of faith, somehow distinguishing the faith of the Jews and the faith of the Christians. So the first kind of faith, he said, he called it spontaneous trust. This is based on the fact that I trust someone without being able to give sufficient reason for my trust in him. So I trust God without being able to also give sufficient reason for my trust in God. Right? Why do you pray? It's difficult to answer, right? Give a very rational answer that could, that could withstand extreme rational scrutiny. So this depends upon a state of contact, meaning contact, meeting, relationship, a contact of my entire being with the one whom I trust. Okay, so status is important in this trust. One finds himself in the selection of faith. One is primarily a member of a community whose covenant with the unconditional, with the one, includes and determines him within. An example of this kind of faith is the early period in the history of the Jewish people of Israel. So, in Judaism, you are born into your faith. So, they can claim that they have contact with God because, of course, from Abraham to Moses to the prophets, so there is a contact. Okay, there's a contact, and you can see the history of Israel that it is really a relationship of trust, no, Jewish people with God. Now, the second kind of faith is what he called rationalized belief. Rationalized belief. This faith is based on the fact that I acknowledge a thing as true or a being as true without being able to give sufficient reason for its truth. Okay? I acknowledge something as existing, as true, without being able to give sufficient reason whether that being really exists. So it depends an act of, uh, it depends, so it depends on an act of acceptance by my entire being of that which I acknowledge to be true. So I accept this to be true, even if I cannot give sufficient reason why that thing or that being is true. So contact in trust can lead to acceptance, and acceptance can lead to contact. So the point of Buber is very nice because, yes, and this is the example that Buber gave to this rationalized belief is the early period of Christianity. Okay, so the Jews in the earlier history, they have established contact, and because of that contact, they trust God. Okay, but acceptance can also lead to contact. If we accept the Christian faith, then it can also lead to relationship, to contact. So Buber is not saying that only the Jewish people can have contact with God. Everybody can have contact, can have relationship with God. So the act is the important thing. One is connected to it by accepting. One is primarily an isolated individual, and a community arises as the forming together of converted individuals. Okay? So, like the example of the early Christians, they are converted individuals. So, this leads us to two kinds of relationship: devotio and gnosis. Devotion pertains to the spontaneous trust, the unreduced service to the divine made present. This is pure faith, according to Buber. And gnosis, which is the rationalized belief, is knowing relationships to the divine. This is rationalized conviction and rationalized faith, right? So, again, for Buber, God is not an it, and he cannot be expressed but only addressed. That's very important. He cannot be expressed but only addressed. We cannot fully express who God is. But even though we cannot fully express, fully know, fully understand who or what He is, we can address God. Meaning, we can communicate, we can relate to God. And according to me, Buber, this is one of my favorite takes of Buber. Many people speak about God, but do not know how to speak, no, or how to talk to God. So many people, they want to talk about God. They talk about God, but they don't talk to God. There are also people who do not know God, but talk to God. You see the difference? People speak about God, but they don't speak to Him. Philosophers talk about God. Professors, teachers, learned men, they talk about God. And they can probably explain what, who, why God is. But they never address God. They never talk to God. They never establish relationship with God. And there are also people who do not know about God. They are not philosophers. They are not theologians. They are not teachers. They don't know who is this God. They cannot philosophize. They cannot give a good theology. But they constantly speak to God. They relate to God. They address God. Okay? So, according to Buber, if to believe in God means to be able to talk about Him in the third person, then I do not believe in God. But if to believe in Him is to be able to talk to Him, meaning in the first person, I address God, then I believe in God. So, belief in God for Buber is not talking about God. It is talking to God. He said it is the God who could give Daniel his the exact information about the world. That's not my God, not our God, but the God to whom Daniel prayed in his suffering when he was down there in the den with the lion. That is the God of all. Okay? So the God for Buber is the God who can give you objective knowledge about the world. But the God you can talk to, the God who can give us comfort in our suffering. Okay? So we cannot reduce God to, to some kind of a logical concept, not even to a metaphysical concept that we can explicate, that we can explain, you know, we can philosophize. These, according to Buber, are the God of the philosophers. The real God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And we know what that means. This is the God we can talk to, the God we can pray to, especially during this time of pandemic. So thank you very much for listening, and be safe, and God bless.